Hi everyone, good to see you all. My name is Galaz. I'm going to present some new work. It's the first time I give this version of the talk, so it's a little bit rusty. This is a tryout. But I want to talk about how the financial sector, and in particular investments, link to novel diseases and the role of forests in that. So this is new work. I want to start with this little story. So this is Eric McIntyre, he's 53. He was feeling fatigue, he was losing weight over a couple of weeks. And one evening out with his friends in doing some karaoke in Arizona, he started to bleed, nosebleed. And he got hospitalized and he was diagnosed with something called the valley fever. So the valley fever emerges from a fungus spore that you inhale, and then it slowly takes over your body. And Eric is now paralyzed, and he's probably not going to be able to walk again. This is a story from the Washington Post, in case you're interested. Why do I bring this up? The reason is that it seems that there might be a link between climate change and this disease. These spores hide in dry soil. And when you get events of very long dry seasons, and these dry seasons expand in space, you get these in more areas, the risks that people get valley fever increases. This is being explored at the moment. There's no simple link between climate change and these types of disease outbreaks, but it's just one example of the complex connections between climate change and planetary change and human health. Another example is, of course, malaria. Some of you might know that malaria is making a comeback. Previously, climate projections said that malaria would decrease all over the world, but now actually we're seeing an increase because of more frequent extreme weather events. Actually, some of these vectors have become resistant to some of the pesticides that we have developed. And in general, climate change and habitat change. Again, it's not a simple relationship between climate change, environmental change, and human health, but we know there is a connection. And that connection has been quite clear for some time. And some of these so-called emerging and re-emerging diseases have a link to the animal world, called zoonotic diseases. Some of them emerging from changed interactions between humans and non-human species, where you see diseases jump. And another thing that we learned the hard way through the COVID pandemic is that we are entering a phase of planetary change and climate change that has put it in a position where the risks of a new pandemic are high, right? COVID-19 is not going to be the last pandemic we experience. We might see other ones, hopefully not as dangerous as COVID, but similar type of diseases. What's interesting with this, and a little bit scary, so the IPBES, which you probably all know about, the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystems, noted that in 2020 that the risk of a pandemic is not driven only by wildlife markets. Normally you would think about a wildlife market in China and then say, hey, look, it's because people are eating these weird animals that we're getting diseases. Actually, a lot of this is the result of human activities, right? So we're deforestation, urbanization, expansion of agriculture, global trade, global transports, etc. What I find quite interesting in the way the IPBES talks about this, and a lot of people talk about this, is when we say human activities, which is, or anthropogenic changes, which I find extremely vague. And vague in a sense because we know that these human activities, in some senses, are about particular type of economic activities in particular regions, driven by particular companies and funded by particular financial entities. So that's why we try to unpack this a little bit more. Which are these activities? Is there any way we can look into the corporations or economic sectors responsible? And in the last part, look into who are investing in these companies. Because that would put investors in a position where they actually could actively help reduce disease risks. Right? That's how we looked at it. What would we do? So there has been a global mapping attempt by Allen, was published a couple of years ago, where they mapped out global disease hotspots in the world, zoonotic disease hotspots, looking into number of reports and trying to deal with reporting biases. There are always reporting biases in this. And they ran a couple of models, etc. And what they identified was actually many of the drivers of these novel diseases, emerging and re-emerging diseases, are anthropogenic changes in land use, right? And many of them are linked to deforestation. Not all, but many. So what we did was essentially to identify 6 regions in the world, these hotspot regions, so we know these are prone, high disease risks evolving here, and many of them linked to deforestation or forest fragmentation, those kind of activities. And in the next step, we looked into the commodities linked to these deforestation and land use drivers. And through that, we started to explore, can we link companies to these sectors, to these land use drivers, and then look into their investors. This is not a perfect analysis. This is a pilot study. We developed a framework. You can look into more regions. You can look into more drivers besides from deforestation, etc. But this is a first step, just to see the connection between investments, economic activities, land use change, deforestation, and diseases, right? And why would you be interested to look into the financial sector at all? Some people would ask, now, isn't it all about policy making or people making better choices instead of deforesting, doing something else? So these are the assumptions, right, that we work through, and this is why investors are interested in these kind of issues. First of all, if you're running a company, you want to extract a resource, you need capital. You need to pay people, you need to buy stuff, right? So you need investors. So that's one observation. We also know from a couple of studies that access to capital partly explain deforestation rates. A lot of things explain deforestation rates. You know it, you're experts. But there are some evidence to show that actually access to capital and cheap capital adds an additional amplifying factor of deforestation. Part of the success of the soy moratorium that you know of was actually, I believe, that they managed to have stricter restrictions on local credit for these types of activities in Brazil. We also know that investors, so think about pension funds, think about insurance companies or other types of investors, they do influence corporate policies, right? Because investors have the right to vote on the annual meetings of companies, they have the access to the CEO and the board, and they can force a company to design and enforce policies, like deforestation policies. They can do it. And the other thing is that we have seen investors, and in particular investor networks, so global collaborations of investors, to try to mobilize in ways to support different types of goals, whether it's climate change or deforestation. I mean, there have been a couple of investor alliances and initiatives to try to pressure companies to deal with deforestation risks. So that's why they're important. And then the last point, that the World Health Organization and the world's countries are currently discussing a new treaty, pandemic treaty for the world, because the old one needed to be updated, apparently, as we saw from COVID-19. In that work, there needs to be preventive work. We can't not just passively wait for the next pandemic. There needs to be some prevention work. We believe, and we argue in our work, that working through the financial sector and a particular type of companies could help mitigate the next pandemic. That's the argument. Running through this quickly, how do we assess financial influence? So there are 2 ways that we explored it. So one is just to look at the size of ownership. Like, this is why you have this giant, right? So the bigger portfolio, the more ownership you have in a company, and in as many companies as possible, the more powerful you are. There's also something called block holding power, essentially meaning that if you are an investor and you have over 5% of ownership in a company, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually a lot. You have a strong voice. So we made metrics based on that. And the other thing that we did, which was quite novel, and I'm not going to take credit for it because it was my colleague Juan Rocha, many of you may know him, we looked into network metrics. So essentially, an investor and a country, well, the country, can be powerful not because of the size of their ownership, but just how they are positioned in a network. That's one of the assumptions that we look at. And we also looked into the network formation process. What's the likelihood that one investor would invest in one particular country in that sector, right? I'm running out of time, but I'm going to give you the highlights now. So what did we discover? And you can find everything in the article. First of all, we find normally, as influential, US-based financial giants. How many of you have heard of the big three investors? Some of you. Okay, wow, that's a lot actually. So not a big surprise. We do find the big three there. So BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And again, the Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund, classic. Whenever you look into financial influence in these sectors, you will find these guys. Interesting though, if you look into the case studies we looked at, there are quite important regional differences. So it's not only the big three, you will see patterns where you would need to engage both global and regional investors. So for example, Southeast Asia, you would have Singapore, and Japan, for example. In Africa, you'll see a different pattern. The other thing, when we looked into the network formation process, probably not a big surprise, because this follows global supply chains logically, is that we see the same pattern for investment. So the global north tends to invest in companies that operate in the global south, and therefore creating disease risks in these regions. Not a big surprise maybe, but now we have a little bit more evidence to back that up. The other third observation is the fact that, and this was a surprise from the data, that Sweden pops up as one key public investor in these networks. Again, not because of the size of ownership. It's not big ownership. We're not talking billions of dollars, but the way Sweden is positioned in these global networks, Sweden could collaborate with others and have global impact by helping to reduce zoonotic disease risks. And there are other financial entities too. So you have SE-banken, Handelsbanken, and Swedbank also investing in here. And then the third and last point that I want to make, which you can also find in the article, is that some of these investors and companies do have deforestation policies, and they should enforce deforestation policies. But if you want to help prevent the next pandemic and deal with zoonotic disease risks, you also need to add that additional angle. So you might need to do ecological restoration, keeping these diseases in mind to protect people from them. You need to create social safety nets for people on the ground, boost health systems to make sure they don't get impacted too hard, and create early warning systems. This is a slightly different approach than just deal with deforestation. You need to consider health impacts on people as well. So that's the key argument of what we did. And if you want to know more, of course, the paper came out on Monday or Tuesday. You can find all details. It has a huge supporting information document. But yeah, maybe can inspire some new work from you too. Thank you very much.